السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continue inshallah ta'ala with 50 hadith, the completion of the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, but the 50 hadith by Imam Rajab rahimahullah in the book Jami al-Ulum wal-Hikam. And last time we talked about the hadith of the manners of eating and not filling one's stomach. And today's with the hadith number 48, أربع من كنا فيه كان منافقا. 4 things or 4 qualities, whoever has them, he will be a munafiq or a hypocrite. This hadith that we probably heard many times before, we need to understand what it means, and we need to protect ourselves from these evil characteristics that are mentioned in them. Let's first read the hadith and then we'll go through the explanation briefly, inshallah. He says, عن عبد الله بن عمرو رضي الله عنهما عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال أربع من كنا فيه كان منافقا. أربع, 4 things. Whoever has them, من كنا فيه, whoever has them in him, كان منافقا, he would be a munafiq. He is a munafiq, he's a hypocrite. ومن كانت خصلة منهن فيه, and whoever خصلة is one aspect or one of these 4 in him, كانت فيه خصلة من النفاق, that means he has in him a characteristics of nifaq or hypocrisy, حتى يدعاها till he leaves it. One of these 4, من إذا حدث كذب, whoever speaks lies, وإذا وعد أخلف, and when he promises he أخلف, he breaks his promise, وإذا خاصم فجر, and if he خاصم in a dispute or quarrelsome, فجر, he will commit fujur and corruption and evil. وإذا عاهد غدر, and if he have a covenant, he would betray it. خرجه البخاري ومسلم. This is by Bukhari and Muslim. This hadith is in the subject of an-nifaq. An-nifaq, as we know, or hypocrisy, is such an evil one, and the root of it is one person's secret is different than his openly acted or openly shown actions to the people. And there's difference between the secrets or what's in his heart and what's the outside appearance and speech and actions. That's the root of it. And therefore, an-nifaq, there are major nifaq and minor nifaq. Nifaqun akbar or nifaqun asghar. And it's important to know these meanings because some people can fall easily into extremism in which they would apply this hadith. If someone falls into these types of things, which is in the category of sins, they would call them munafiq or hypocrite, or they would confuse the subject of an-nifaq of what's how mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ with regards to the munafiqeen, the hypocrites at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and would basically call people, munafiqeen in that sense, that means they negated the deen of Islam from their own selves. And that's not the case. If a person understands the 2 categories of nifaq, nifaqun akbar, major nifaq, that takes the person outside the fold of Islam. And that is the nifaq in which a person would hide kufr. He's not a believer, he's a disbeliever. But he's pretending to be among the believers for whatever reason there is, to plot against them, to cause corruption among them. But in reality, he never entered the fold of Islam. He's just a disbeliever, but pretending, imitating the ways of the disbelievers. Also, the major nifaq can be from someone that is a Muslim and then he falls into the major nifaq. It takes him outside the fold of Islam. And that's also valid to happen. The Maidan Effect, or they call it an-nifaq al-amali, the practical nifaq that comes into action, and this hadith talks about this one. So it talks about actions or characteristics. Whoever has them, he has one of the characteristics of hypocrisy, because again, it's the double standard, if it's correct to say, what's in the heart versus what's in the outside appearance. And the person imitated the munafiqeen, because the munafiqeen, the hypocrites, they have these types of qualities, till he refrain away completely from it. So the first one, إِذَا حَدَّثَ كَذَبَ, whenever he speaks, he lies. And we know that lying is a major sin. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade it and talks about those who lies, and it's always mentioned the sin of lying in the Quran, that this is one of the characteristics of the disbelievers, and the believer is never a liar, and that's why a person should stay away from lying, whether it's whether it's for when a person is playing or when a person is joking or whatever, under any question and under circumstances. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he saw someone that was saying to his son or to saying to her son to come and she would give him a date, and the Prophet ﷺ said that if you don't give it to him, that will be considered kadhiba, that means a lying. So this is to show how evil it is to lie. And the Prophet ﷺ said, الصدق طمأنينة والكذب ريبة. To be truthful, this is tranquility. والكذب ريبة. Kadhib makes a person always lying, makes a person always anticipating something bad to happen, being always disturbed and things like this. Because al-kadhib is, or lying is, every single evil comes from lying, because of how evil it is. And it causes diseases to the heart. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the hypocrites, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَقُولُ آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَبِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَمَا هُمْ مُؤْمِنِينَ يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَمَا يَخْدَعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُم وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ في قلوبهم مرض فزادهم الله مرضا ولهم عذاب أليم بما كانوا يكذبون. In their hearts are disease, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increased the diseases of the heart, and they have a painful punishment because of what they used to lie. Also, there's a sound hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, the meaning of which that al-kadhib yunqisu rizq, lying decreases one's provisions. Right? And one of the evidence of that is al-bay'an bil-khiyar ma lam yatafarraq. The buying and selling person, they are with the choice of whether to continue with the transaction, not as long as they are together. فَإِنْ صَدَقَ وَبَيَّنَ. If they're truthful and they make the matter clear, بُورِكَ لَهُمَا فِي بَيْعِهِمَا, it will, their merchandise or their trade will be blessed. وَإِنْ كَتَمَ وَكَذَبَ. And if they hide or lie, then the barakah will be taken away from what they're selling. And so it's the kadhib is one of the dangers of lying, is that it's a sin that a person gets used to it until it becomes his norm. It's not a one-time sin that is committed and that's it. It becomes easier and easier for the person to lie. So, and it leads the person to al-fujur, as the Prophet ﷺ said. وَلَا يَزَالُ الْعَبْدُ وَإِنَّ إِيَّاكُمُ الْكَذِبَ فَإِنَّ الْكَذِبَ يَهْدِي الْفُجُورَ. Do not lie, because lying leads the person to al-fujur, which is the same word is used in the Hadith. وَإِذَا خَاصَمَ فَجَرَ. The third action here, if he disputes, he do fujur, and that's one of the things that lying leads to have that fujur, to have that evilness in oneself. Al-fujur is to always stay away from al-haq, is to be away from the truth, and to always push away the truth, and oppose the truth, and argue against the truth. That's what fujur is. So this is one of the outcome of lying. So إذا حدث كذب. So therefore, it's very important that a person is truthful with his own self, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the children, with his enemies, with everyone. To be honest and to be truthful, and that's one of the major major sins, as we know, and a person should stay away from it and should always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect oneself from such a sin. So من إذا حدث كذب وإذا وعد أخلف. وإذا وعد أخلف. And if he promises, he breaks his promise. Promising or breaking the promise is of two types here. If a person, while he is promising, he's intended clearly that he would not fulfill the promise, this is a clear characteristics of the hypocrites. While he's promising, he's lying, he's just saying it to save himself from trouble, whatever, but he has no plans to fulfill his promise. And that's a very obvious one. The second type is that if a person promises truly with the intention of fulfillment of his promise, but then he breaks his promise without any excuse, that also falls into the same category, but of a lesser evil. Without an excuse, he just, no reason, he just, breaks his promise. The third category, if someone that promised and he intended to fulfill his promise, but then there was a reason why he would break his promise. If that reason is because to fulfill the promise he has to commit haram, then it's an obligation upon him not to fulfill the promise. So breaking the promise in this case becomes a virtuous deed, becomes a mandatory deed, because it would if he promised to commit a sin. Someone promised someone to steal, for example. Can he fulfill that promise? Of course not. Also, if fulfilling that promise is something that is difficult for him, or is something that he's unable to do, or there's something else benefiting. This is what the ulama, they had the opinions whether it's permissible to break the promise in this case or not. Not that they had differences of opinions whether it's permissible to promise with the intention of breaking the promise, or promising and breaking the promise without an excuse. It's only, for the things that is, there's something else that better for a person to do if he doesn't break the promise. Right? So this is an evil thing for a person to break his promise. So the exception is if it's by necessity something important for a person to do. So with consensus among the ulama, that whoever promises someone something that is not forbidden, then he has to fulfill his promise. And the majority that it's mustahab, it's recommended, because this is what he needs to do, otherwise he might commit or fall into the sin. وَإِذَا وَعَدَ أَخْلَفَ. The third one, وَإِذَا خَاصَمَ فَجَرَ. وَإِذَا خَاصَمَ فَجَرَ. خاصم, that means he in a quarrelsome. When he's in a dispute with someone, he would fall into fujur. And fujur, as we said, is to be away from the truth and to argue against it. Al-khusuma, or to be in dispute with someone, extracts from the person the worst of him. Right? When you are in dispute, the worst of you as a human being comes out. And that's why if a person wants to see himself, whether he is a good person or a bad person, right, whether he has good manners or not, then he should see himself when he's being tested, not at times of ease. At times of ease, everybody is wonderful, but at times of when he's being tested with an individual, tested in a dispute, how is he going to act in the dispute? Is he going to turn away from the haqq, from the truth, because if he's upon the haqq, he would lose in the dispute? This is where signs of hypocrisy is, when a person in the dispute, he would turn away from the haqq so that he would think that he's gaining from it. So al-fujur, again, as we said, is the root meaning of it comes from al-mayl an al-haqq, to turn away from the haqq. So, and since al-kadhib, or lying, leads to fujur, so it's basically al-fujur fi al-khisam, or إذا خاصم فجر, as the ulama, they say, هو الكذب فيه, is to lie in the dispute that makes a person turn away from the haqq. So a person in a dispute, it becomes easier for him to lie. He'd say, I didn't do this, I didn't say this, he said this, he did this. He would lie. And that's al-fujur. وَإِذَا خَاصَمَ فَجَرَ. And the righteous one is whenever there is a dispute, he would still say the truth. Also, one of the meanings of it is when a person in a dispute, since he's away from the haqq, turns away from the haqq, and he would harm the other one, to retaliate, for example, to do evil things. Like someone in a dispute, someone said something bad to a person, so instead he retaliated by, beating him up or causing extreme harm, and not to be just. So the believers, they are just even in their times of dispute, and they don't cause or commit any form of injustices. Otherwise, it's one of the characteristics of the hypocrites, because they don't fear Allah. وَإِذَا عَاهَدَ غَدَرَ. And the last one, وَإِذَا عَاهَدَ غَدَرَ. Whenever he has a covenant, he would break his covenant. And al-ghadr, or to break the covenant is something that is again evil, and these are some things that are very clear for a person when he is to any human being, that to break the covenant basically. So وَإِذَا عَاهَدَ غَدَرَ, that means whenever he is in a covenant, he would betray his covenant. So this is has many different implications to it. So like the fujur and the khusuma, to claim for something for him that it does not belong to him, or to deny something that he's been accused of, and so on. And the same way when a person is in a covenant with someone, some like the promise or a covenant between two individuals with matters of authority or the like of this, and a person would make ghadr, that means khiyana, that means he would betray the covenant. This is one of the signs of hypocrisy. So وَإِذَا عَاهَدَ غَدَرَ. And Allah, there is the ahd between the believers and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And there is the ahd and the covenant between the believers towards one another, to help them, to take care of them and so on, and they don't fulfill the covenant. Or even the ahd or the covenant with the kuffar, it's also to be fulfilled and not to be betrayed. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ said, وَإِذَا عَاهَدَ غَدَرَ. And this is one of the signs of hypocrisy. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from hypocrisy, whether it's major or something to do with the practical part of hypocrisy. Otherwise, one of the worst thing to do to oneself is to decrease one's iman, to destroy one's iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to fulfill the covenants. وَأَوْفُوا بِالْعَهْدِ إِنَّ الْعَهْدَ كَانَ مَسْئُولًا. You will be asked about your covenants. وَأَوْفُوا بِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ. Fulfill the ahd of Allah. إِذَا عَاهَدْتُمْ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَشْتَرُونَ بِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ وَإِيمَانِهِمْ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. Those who would purchase things of this dunya, attain things of this dunya as a result of breaking the covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So betraying, and it will be for anyone that betrays anyone, he would come on the day of judgment, and it will be established for him like a flag of the covenant. It will be said, this is the ghadra of fulan, this is the betrayal of so and so. To give someone security and then to betray that. You say, I'm not going to do any harm to you, and then you get him and you harm him, right? So, and then there's another narration, al-khiyana fil amana, if he's entrusted with something, he would betray his trust, and he would not fulfill it in the right way. So ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from that, inshallah. طيب, we'll continue inshallah ta'ala tomorrow. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى صحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.